All right, so this is going to be a brief overview of projection mapping inside of Nuke and how we can kind of use it to our advantage when we're using it for paintwork. So hopefully this won't take too long. I'm going to try to breeze through it and hit the major stuff. So let's start with an image like this. It's pretty straightforward. We have some pretty simple imagery, but it does have some complex shapes in it. And we're going to see that we can get away with quite a bit with this. But first, let's just take a look at how the workflow for this operates. We'll have our typical scene here, our image, and I'm just reformatting it here to HD size. And we're going to ignore this for a moment and kick down here. Now, this is our read geo, and what I did is I actually modeled this in Maya. It would be just as easy to model this in Nuke using some fairly basic shapes such as cubes for here, the cutting mat and the bench. And I put this together. This is actually possible to model in Nuke, although it's a little bit of a pain. But this is my basic scene geometry, and it's scaled, and my camera makes it aligned with the scene. And what you would normally do is for geometry, this image input here represents texture maps. And what I've done is I've actually gone through and I've created UV maps for, or UV layouts for all my geometry. So you can see that as I pump my imagery into it, it just lays right into the UVs of the geometry. And it's not really useful in this instance. But what I can do is I can take my camera, which is out here, and this is the same position as my camera was shot in, which you would achieve if you did a match move. And I'm going to take a single point from this camera, right? A lot of times you don't necessarily want this camera to be animated if you're doing paintwork. But we'll take this one shot, and we're going to feed the imagery through this Project 3D node. And you'll notice that this Project 3D node doesn't have that many options. It's pretty straightforward. So we'll take the imagery and we'll pump it into this, and from here we'll take it into our texturing information, and you'll see immediately that this is working exactly like a projector. And this projector takes the imagery and just splats it right onto our geometry here. Okay, now why is this necessarily useful is something we'll get to in just a moment. All right, so moving on down, this is really like the simplest of layouts that we could have here, where we have our projection camera feeding to our Project 3D node. That's taking our footage, and that's feeding it to our geometry as a texture map. And then this gets fed to a Scanline render node, which also has a camera. Now this would be your match move camera, most likely, but you know, anything's possible. And then from here, if I view this node, oops, and notice here that I've got my camera not intact, which is fine. I'm loading this from the same Alembic file. Right? Now if I switch over to my Scanline render node and I tab over to my 2D, it looks exactly like my imagery up here, right? Except for the fact that I can turn on, can I turn on? I think I'd have to throw, I think I have a wireframe shader I could throw into here. See, my geometry is right in there. Operation, over. There we go. And you can see that my geometry is laying right into this scene because I did align my camera as if it was done with a match move. And you can see that each of these parts lines up. Now we've seen a couple things that we could do once our scene is projected into 3D. You know, one of those things being able to place a card in here. And for that, we do need, if we have multiple pieces of geometry, we need a scene node. Right? And once we put this card in here, and I'll put a simple, well, that's not a card, that's a card 3D. Ignore card 3D. I can put a checkerboard on here and assign this into here. Why won't you go? There it is. Okay. And then out here, simply taking my card, right? Here is our card, and we can rotate it. And when we look at it in Scanline, you'll see that we're able to place things in 3D. And for all intents and purposes, have quite a bit of ability to manipulate them through the scene. I'm just moving it backwards into the scene. And then I'll slide it down a little bit and have some interactivity with the objects in our scene, which is really quite lovely, right? We can get away with quite a bit with this. So that's the most basic example. And one thing we'll just take a quick look at is how this read geo node works. Okay, if I take a look at this, this particular read geo node has all of, whoops, where are my objects here? Let me paste this in. Once you load in a read geo, you'll see that you get everything from your scene loaded in, including your camera. And that's how this one is loaded. I've turned off the camera by just unclicking this one little section here. And we can turn everything off. We can turn on just one thing. For example, if I just wanted the pliers, I could just turn those on, all right? And these names come from my scene because I am an organized person to some degree. And I say create all in one node. And you see what will happen now is if I load this into my scene, that the only thing I have is the pliers, right? Whereas in this case, I get everything. So if we take this to its next logical conclusion, what we can do is we could create a series of these nodes and load in as much individual geometry as we need. Okay, and here, feeding from one project 3D, we'll get the same instance. So here we are starting with the same scene, reformatting it the same way. Whoops, bring my viewer over here. Coming down to the same project 3D node, right? And then instead of having a single node, we have all of these. And I don't really need all of these. This is just to prove a point, right? Here is the drill bit box, and here is the cutting mat, and here is the hammer cube, and my match cube, right? Now, so why would we want to do all of this? Well, if we have all this geometry, we can gain a little bit more flexibility. You'll notice that, again, the same scene looks exactly the same. But one thing we would want to do, what if we wanted to move this cube? Now, we could come into here and we could actually type in a value to move this, right? And I'll look at it from 3D here. Or I can lift it directly up. But you'll notice that the texture slides directly on it, right? And even though I've moved it up, looking at this Scanline render, it looks identical because that geometry is getting the projection from the exact same point as the camera. Therefore, we really can't ever see a change that we make in our geometry. So if we wanted to move this cube, how would we go about it? Okay. Well, let's think about splitting up our scene a little bit more. So one thing I'll do first is I'm going to create a new camera in Scanline just by copying this one. And I'm going to feed this cube over to here. All right, so what does that gain us? Right? It gains us the ability to see this cube all by itself. Now, we could technically parent this camera to this geometry and move it all together, and that would work. But it's not exactly what we want because we still have the potential of a sliding texture if something becomes misaligned. So let's take a closer look at this node, the Scanline render. By popping into here, we have several options. The Scanline render options, the default options are here. Things like multi-sample are for motion blur and depth of field. shader samples for creating motion vectors and generating depth maps and things like that. We have deep rendering options, which we don't want to talk about right now. But let's go back to here. One of the things that's really useful here is, first of all, anti-aliasing. We can have some of that. That's good. Although if we're doing projections, we don't really have to worry about it. Z-blending is not something we need to worry about in this instance, although hopefully we'll cover it. It's wonderful. Overscan is for when you need to be taking into account something like lens distortion. But the one I really want to talk about is this one here, the projection mode. Now, by default, the projection mode is the render camera, right? We're rendering exactly what this camera is seeing in the typical format that we would realize, right? And once again, I'm going to put a wireframe shader in here so we can see. Oops, not there. Here. Let's get my viewer out of the way here. I'll put this wireframe right in the middle, hopefully. Oh, well, I need to put it up here. Let me switch it to over. All right, so we can see. All right, so we can see that this is our typical view. Now we have a couple options in this projection mode. We have perspective, which is really no different. We have orthographic, which provides us with a flat look, which is sometimes useful. But in this case, clearly, our camera is not positioned in a way that it makes sense. We have spherical, which allows us to render a fully spherical image, which can be incredibly handy. But really, for us, we want this one, UV. And what's happening here is that you'll see that the projected image is now going to be placed into the UV layout of our particular object here. Okay, so you can see that I've got the 6 faces of my cube laid out, and the projection is falling onto the top, the front, and the side. And those are landing directly into my 3D, into my UV map. Now, you can see that that's with one object. If we come back over to our scene here, and we had all of our objects once again, you'll notice that if I turn that on, it becomes an incredible mess. Right? Because everything's on top of itself. Right? So, depending on your layout, you can maybe get away with it. But in this case, we're just going to look at the one object, right? And that's really handy. Okay, so then what can we do here? Well, I can now take this object. I'm going to copy it and paste it. Let me get rid of my wireframes. And I'm going to feed this render into a copy of this object. And this becomes incredibly handy because I can feed this back in and we can look at our render. And you'll notice now that it looks exactly the same as it did before, except I'm bypassing my cube as I was, creating a texture map from my projection and feeding it into the texture of this cube again. So when we put that into our Scanline, I'm actually going to introduce you to a new node here called the transform, right? It's under the modify. From the 3D menu, the modify, we have a transform geo. This is a nice little node that allows you to abstract your animation from geometry, so you can easily swap things out if you need to. So you'll notice here that if I start putting in a rotation value, that my cube starts to rotate. Now, what we're noticing though is that we do get some artifacts, right? But beyond that, like this seems something like could be very successful. So the question is, where is this artifact coming from? Well, if you're playing along at home, you'll probably realize that the projection onto our cutting mat is where that's coming from, right? Because even though from this perspective, this projection looks very stretched, from our projection, from our standard rendering position, that's perfectly in place. So that gives us a little bit of a problem, right? So how do we solve this problem? Well, we do this again. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to grab these 3 nodes. I've done this already, so bear with me. I have a camera already. And you'll notice that one thing I do like to do is when I have camera projections, I do like to color code them, right? So I don't confuse them with my cameras that are very important to the scene. Well, each camera is important, but in a different way. So I'm going to come up here to this little red box, click on it, and choose a color that's a little bit more egregious and interesting for a camera projection, like this crazy purple, right? So that happens to be the color I tend to choose for camera projections. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to decouple my cutting mat. And I'm going to do the exact same process here. Feed it in. And out comes through here and out the other side. Right? So once again, we have no change to our scene. Right? Our cutting mat and our match cube are disassociated. And in this render node, I am also rendering to UV space and reprojecting it, and then using it as a texture, right? I'm not reprojecting it anymore, but I'm using it as a texture onto this geometry again, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. But now, the great advantage of having this UV projection is going to become very clear, right? Let me disconnect these for a moment. And this is where things become really useful, is I essentially don't want this cube on this mat anymore, right? So by hitting P, I can create a rotoscoping node, and I can come in here with my clone tool, which is this one here, which works the same way as it does in Photoshop. I'm going to make a nice big size so you can see what I'm doing, and I'm going to do a terrible job. I'm going to hold down on the Mac, it's called the Command key. On the PC, it's probably the Control key. And I can hold it down and then click and drag and reposition my cloning option here. So what I like to do is get a nice good landmark like this line here. Oops. And get myself aligned with it. And then I can just start to paint away my cube. Right? And I'm going to do a horrible job like this, just so you can sort of get the point. Get another selection here and start working this away like this. Right? And all I'm doing is just cloning. Yeah, I'm doing a terrible job, right? If I had just a few more minutes, I could do a little bit nicer. But we'll start chewing away at this, and we'll see what we can get out of this, right? All right, so ignore that, right? This might be a little bit of a job for Photoshop, maybe some content-aware filling or something like that. Anyways, we chew this away a little bit, and now our texture is different. And if we come back to our scene, right? Let me hide my cube. I'm going to disable my cube here. Pulling it off. And you see that that's my chewed away texture, right? And now I can put this onto here. And I'm going to move my cube up in Y. And you'll see if I move just a little bit, then I've got some leeway, right? Now it looks pretty terrible because I can also dip down into here. It looks pretty terrible because I actually have, no shadow or anything like that. So let me show you, I've done this. Let me delete this old paint, and I'm going to bring in these nodes. Right? Here we are. Now, this is my roto paint. It's bad, right? It's still bad because I did it quickly. And we can look at our scene here. Right? Well, then what I did, let me get to my, here. There's my roto paint. But then what I did is I added a roto shape, right? And if I turn this off, you can see how my roto shape was made. I just kind of lined it up with where I thought the cube was going to be there. Put it in place. And now when I come back to my scene, This is, again, a little egregious, but for a point, I can take this and I can move up in the Y, right? Now, if I was good, what I would do is I would make sure that I linked up some blurring here, maybe feathered this more as I went up, right? Change my fall off to kind of, well, you get the point. Lowered my opacity as it went up. Try to link up the two actions. But what we have now is a thing that we can move around, and we've got quite a bit of leeway with it as well. Right? I can move it back. Right? I can move it forward. It obeys many of the rules, and as long as I've got this linked up to it, that should be no problem. And I can get away with a lot. And initially, we can even start to do things which would have been much more difficult. We can, oops, here we go, start to rotate this shape. If it'll let me rotate it, I'll just do it automatically here. Let's do it with the arrow keys. Arrow keys in the field here, by moving to the ones, tens, or the tenths or 100ths place, you can use the up and down keys to incrementally go up and down. So here I can rotate in the Y, right? And look how much leeway we have with this cube that's been just texture mapped, right? And just by grabbing that texture from the footage, we have so much more leeway and so much more believability before things really break down. So that's just a quick look at this. And I just want to start opening your eyes at how this workflow works, and to not be sort of afraid of this potential workflow. It's very quick to set up. Some of the texture painting does take some time, but the leeway you get is incredible, as opposed to trying to carefully render this out each time. All right, so that's just my quick intro to sort of projections and how you can use them, and I hope that was helpful. All right, thank you.